The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood before her mahogany wardrobe, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for a simple blue dress. Just 6 months ago, this same action would have been accompanied by the gentle guidance of her lady-in-waiting, who would have carefully selected each piece according to the day's engagements. Now, Catherine faced these choices alone, a stark reminder of how dramatically her world had changed. The new protocols had arrived without fanfare, delivered in a crisp, white envelope bearing the royal seal. As Catherine had broken the wax and unfolded the official document, she could never have imagined how thoroughly these changes would reshape not just her public duties, but the very essence of who she was allowed to be within the royal framework. "Your Royal Highness," her private secretary had said that fateful Tuesday morning, his voice carrying an unusual tension. "There have been some adjustments to the royal protocols that will affect your daily activities." The understatement would have been almost comical if the implications hadn't been so profound. Catherine had always prided herself on her ability to connect with people. From her earliest days as a royal, she had made it her mission to bridge the gap between the monarchy and the public. She remembered the warmth in people's eyes when she would stop during walkabouts to truly listen to their stories, to hold their hands when they shared their struggles, to laugh genuinely at their jokes. These moments had never felt like duty to her. They had felt like privilege. The first restriction that hit her personally was perhaps the most painful. She was no longer permitted to engage in spontaneous public interactions. Every conversation, every handshake, every photograph with members of the public now required prior approval and careful orchestration. The days of stopping to comfort a crying child or sitting with an elderly veteran sharing war stories were over. Catherine's mind wandered to Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an 82-year-old widow she had met during a charity visit to a care home just 3 months prior to the protocol changes. Mrs. Hartwell had been sitting alone in the corner, her eyes distant and sad. Catherine had broken away from the formal tour to sit beside her, listening as the elderly woman shared stories of her late husband and their 60-year marriage. They had talked for nearly an hour, and when Catherine finally stood to leave, Mrs. Hartwell had whispered, "Thank you for seeing me, dear. Really seeing me." Under the new protocols, such interactions were impossible. Every encounter was now timed, scripted, and monitored. Catherine felt like she was slowly disappearing behind a wall of regulations that seemed designed to protect the monarchy, but, in doing so, had stripped away the very humanity that had made her role meaningful. The changes extended far beyond public engagements. Catherine's personal social media accounts, which she had used to share glimpses of her family life and promote causes close to her heart, were now heavily regulated. Every post required approval from a committee of advisors who seemed more concerned with avoiding any potential controversy than with authentic communication. Her Instagram account, which had once featured candid photos of her children playing in the garden or her excitement about a new conservation project, now felt sterile and corporate. She remembered the post that had apparently triggered some of these changes. It had been a simple photograph of her hands covered in soil from working in her garden, accompanied by a caption about the therapeutic nature of growing things. The image had received millions of likes and thousands of comments from people sharing their own gardening experiences and struggles with mental health. But somewhere in the palace hierarchy, someone had decided that such personal revelations were too risky, too real for a future queen. Catherine's relationship with the press had also fundamentally shifted. Where once she had been allowed to give spontaneous responses to journalists' questions during engagements, she was now required to stick to predetermined talking points. The authentic moments that had endeared her to the public, her laughter when a child asked if she lived in a castle, her honest admission of the challenges of motherhood, her visible emotion when discussing mental health, were now carefully managed out of existence. The impact on her family life was equally profound. The new protocols restricted when and how her children could appear at public events. The sweet moments that the public had cherished, Prince George's shy waves, Princess Charlotte's confident handshakes, Prince Louis's playful antics, were now subject to such rigid scheduling and supervision that they lost all spontaneity. Catherine watched as her children, who had once seemed natural and comfortable at public events, began to stiffen under the weight of increased formality. William tried to shield her from the worst of his own frustrations with the changes, but Catherine could see the strain in his eyes. As the heir to the throne, he was walking a delicate balance between supporting his wife and maintaining family unity. During their private conversations in the evening, when the children were asleep and the palace staff had retreated, he would hold her hand and remind her that these changes weren't permanent, that protocols evolved with time and circumstance. But Catherine wasn't certain she believed that anymore. Each day brought new restrictions, new guidelines, new ways in which her authentic self was being carefully edited out of her public role. She had entered the royal family believing she could modernize it from within, that she could help bridge the gap between tradition and contemporary relevance. Now she felt like she was being systematically transformed into something she didn't recognize. The irony wasn't lost on her that in an effort to protect the monarchy's reputation, the very qualities that had made her popular with the public were being suppressed. The polls still showed strong support for her personally, but Catherine could feel the gradual shift in public perception as her engagements became more formal and less personal. Her mother, Carol, had visited the previous weekend, and Catherine had seen the worry in her eyes as they walked through the palace gardens. "You seem different, darling," Carol had said gently. More guarded. Catherine had tried to brush off the observation, but she knew her mother was right. The protocols weren't just changing her public behavior. They were changing her. Sleep had become elusive. Catherine would lie awake at night, staring at the ornate ceiling of their bedroom, wondering how she had gone from being a person who happened to be royal to being a royal who struggled to remain a person. She missed the freedom to be imperfect, to be surprised, to react genuinely to the unexpected moments that made life rich and meaningful. The weight of always being watched, always being judged, always having to consider the implications of every word and action had begun to feel overwhelming. Catherine had always been resilient, but this felt different. This felt like she was being asked to give up pieces of herself in service to an institution that seemed increasingly disconnected from the very people it was meant to serve. During a particularly difficult morning, as she prepared for a carefully orchestrated visit to a children's hospital where every interaction would be monitored and timed, Catherine caught sight of herself in the mirror. The reflection that looked back at her was perfectly groomed, appropriately dressed, and utterly composed. But behind her eyes, she could see a sadness that no amount of protocol training had prepared her for. She thought about the children she would meet that day, how they would look at her with hope and excitement, unaware that her responses were limited by guidelines and restrictions. These children, facing their own battles with illness and fear, deserved her authentic presence, her real emotions, her genuine care. But the new protocols made such authentic connection increasingly difficult. As Catherine picked up her handbag and prepared to face another day of carefully managed public service, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was being lost. The monarchy was meant to evolve with the times, to remain relevant and connected to the people it served. But these changes seemed to be pushing it in the opposite direction, creating more distance rather than less. The woman who had once comfortably navigated between her role as a mother, wife, and public figure now found herself questioning whether such balance was even possible anymore. The protocols that governed her life seemed to demand a level of perfection that left no room for the beautiful imperfections of human connection. Standing at the threshold of another carefully orchestrated day, Catherine couldn't help but wonder what other changes lay ahead, and whether the person she was becoming was someone she would even recognize a year from now. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Catherine's private office as she sat surrounded by stacks of briefing documents, each one outlining the precise parameters of her upcoming engagements. 3 weeks had passed since the protocol changes had begun to take effect, and Catherine was beginning to understand the full scope of how her life was being reshaped. Her chief of staff, Margaret, entered the room with another folder of guidelines. Margaret had served the royal family for over 2 decades, and Catherine could see the discomfort in her expression as she placed the documents on the desk. "Your Royal Highness, these are the updated guidelines for tomorrow's school visit," she said, her voice carefully neutral, but her eyes betraying her own frustration with the restrictions. Catherine opened the folder to find a minute-by-minute schedule that left no room for spontaneity. Even the questions she might ask the children were suggested in advance, along with appropriate responses to various scenarios. Reading through the document, she felt as though she was preparing to play a character rather than simply being herself. The impact on her charitable work had been particularly devastating. Catherine had always approached her patronages with genuine passion, diving deep into the causes she supported and forming real relationships with the organizations she represented. The new protocols required her to maintain a more distant, ceremonial role that felt hollow compared to the hands-on involvement she had previously enjoyed. Her work with mental health awareness, something that had become deeply personal to her over the years, was now heavily scrutinized. The authentic conversations she had once had with individuals struggling with mental health challenges were replaced by carefully worded speeches and stage photo opportunities. Catherine remembered a young mother named Sarah who had approached her at an event 6 months earlier, tears streaming down her face as she shared her battle with postpartum depression. "You saved my life," Sarah had whispered to Catherine that day. "When you talked about your own struggles with motherhood, when you said it was okay to not be okay, it gave me permission to ask for help." They had embraced, and Catherine had given Sarah her private email address, encouraging her to stay in touch. Under the new protocols, such personal connections were strictly forbidden. The restrictions extended to her family relationships in ways Catherine hadn't anticipated. Her visits to see her parents and siblings now required extensive security briefings and advanced planning that made spontaneous family gatherings impossible. The easy relationship she had maintained with her pre-royal friends was strained by the increased formality that now surrounded every aspect of her life. Pippa, her sister, had called the previous evening, and Catherine could hear the sadness in her voice as she explained that their usual sisterly lunches would need to be properly arranged through official channels. The days of quick coffee dates or impromptu shopping trips were over, another casualty of the tightening protocols. Even within the palace walls, Catherine felt the changes. Staff members who had once felt comfortable sharing small jokes or personal anecdotes now maintained a more formal distance. The warm relationships she had built with everyone from kitchen staff to gardeners were being replaced by a professional courtesy that felt cold and isolating. Her daily routine, once flexible enough to accommodate the unpredictable needs of 3 young children, was now rigidly structured. Catherine had always prided herself on being present for bedtime stories, school events, and the small moments that made up family life. The new protocols made such flexibility increasingly difficult, as every aspect of her schedule required approval and coordination with security teams. William was struggling with his own adjustments to the changing dynamics within the royal family. During their private moments together, he would share his frustration with feeling caught between loyalty to his family and protection of his wife. The pressure from senior palace advisors to maintain traditional protocols was constant, while he watched Catherine slowly withdrawing into herself under the weight of the restrictions. One evening, as they walked through the palace gardens after putting the children to bed, William took her hand and stopped beside the rose garden they had planted together during their early years at Kensington Palace. "I see what this is doing to you," he said quietly. "We'll find a way through this. I won't let you disappear." But Catherine wasn't sure it was that simple. The protocols weren't just guidelines. They represented a fundamental shift in how the monarchy viewed its role in modern society. The spontaneity and authenticity that had made her popular with the public were now seen as risks to be managed rather than assets to be celebrated. Her private secretary had shown her the latest polling data, which revealed an interesting paradox. While Catherine's approval ratings remained high, the public was beginning to comment on what they perceived as a change in her demeanor. Social media was filled with observations about her seeming less relaxed, less natural in recent appearances. The very people the protocols were designed to protect the monarchy from were noticing and lamenting the changes. Catherine had always been acutely aware of her unique position as someone who had married into the royal family rather than being born into it. She had worked hard to prove herself worthy of the role while maintaining the relatability that came from her non-royal background. The new protocols seemed designed to erase exactly those qualities that had made her transition successful. The children were beginning to notice the changes too. George, now old enough to understand some of the complexities of royal life, had asked why their appearances at public events felt different. "Mummy," he had said after a recent engagement, "you seemed sad today, even when you were smiling." The observation had cut through Catherine more sharply than any criticism from the press. Charlotte, always perceptive, had begun to mimic the more formal behavior she observed at official events, curtsying to staff members and speaking in the careful, measured tone she heard her mother using in public. Catherine watched her daughter's natural exuberance being replaced by a premature sense of duty and protocol, and it broke her heart. Louis, still young enough to be largely unaffected by the changes, provided Catherine with her only moments of uncomplicated joy. His uninhibited laughter and spontaneous affection reminded her of who she had been before the weight of protocol had begun to reshape her identity. The impact on her marriage, while not discussed openly, was noticeable in small ways. The easy companionship she and William had always shared was strained by the constant awareness of being observed and judged. Even their private moments felt less private, knowing that every aspect of their lives was subject to analysis and adjustment by palace advisors. Catherine found herself grieving for the person she had been just months earlier. The woman who had felt confident in her ability to balance royal duty with personal authenticity now questioned every instinct, second-guessed every impulse to connect genuinely with others. The protocols weren't just changing her behavior, they were changing her fundamental sense of self. During sleepless nights, Catherine would often think about Diana, William's mother, and the struggle she had faced with the constraints of royal life. While the circumstances were different, Catherine was beginning to understand the suffocating weight of being loved by the public, while feeling increasingly trapped by the institution meant to support her. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. The monarchy had embraced her because of her ability to modernize and humanize the institution. Now, those same qualities were being systematically managed out of her public persona in the name of protecting the very institution she had helped to strengthen. As Catherine prepared for bed each night, she would look at herself in the mirror and wonder how long she could continue to perform a version of herself that felt increasingly foreign. The woman looking back at her was still recognizably Catherine, but the light in her eyes seemed dimmer, the smile more practiced than natural. The transformation was gradual, but relentless, and Catherine was beginning to fear that the changes weren't temporary adjustments, but permanent alterations to the very nature of her role within the royal family. Each day brought new evidence that the Catherine the public had fallen in love with was being carefully edited out of existence, replaced by a more conventional, less risky version that bore little resemblance to the woman she had always been. The weight of this realization was becoming harder to bear, and Catherine found herself wondering whether the institution she had devoted her life to serving was slowly destroying the very qualities that had made her service valuable in the first place. The first frost of winter had settled across the palace grounds as Catherine sat in her private study, staring at a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from a young teacher named Emma, who had met Catherine at a school event 2 years earlier. Emma had written to thank Catherine for the encouragement she had given her during a particularly difficult time in her career. "Your words changed my life," the letter read. "You told me that teaching wasn't just a job, it was a calling to touch hearts and minds." I've never forgotten that conversation. Catherine could barely remember giving such advice, but she remembered Emma, a nervous young woman who had seemed overwhelmed by her new position. Under the old protocols, Catherine had been able to spend 20 minutes talking with Emma about her challenges and dreams. Under the new restrictions, such meaningful exchanges were impossible. The past month had brought additional changes that seemed designed to further distance Catherine from the authentic connections that had defined her approach to royal service. Her team of advisors had expanded to include specialists in reputation management and message control, professionals whose job it was to ensure that every aspect of Catherine's public presence aligned with carefully crafted objectives. These new advisors seemed to view Catherine's natural empathy and spontaneity as problems to be solved rather than strengths to be leveraged. During briefing sessions, they would review video footage of her public appearances, analyzing her facial expressions, her body language, even the tone of her voice for potential misinterpretation or controversy. "Your Royal Highness," one of the advisors had said during a particularly uncomfortable session, "when you showed emotion during the hospital visit last week, some observers interpreted it as a sign of instability rather than compassion. We need to work on maintaining a more consistent demeanor." Catherine had wanted to scream. The emotion they were criticizing had been her natural response to meeting a terminally ill child who had reminded her of Charlotte. The idea that grief and compassion needed to be managed and controlled felt like a betrayal of everything she believed about human connection. The children were struggling with the changes in their own ways. George had become more withdrawn, seeming to sense the tension that now surrounded family life. He had always been a sensitive child, and Catherine could see him trying to navigate the increased formality with the same careful consideration he applied to his schoolwork. Charlotte, meanwhile, had begun to rebel against the restrictions in small but noticeable ways. During a recent public appearance, she had deliberately chosen to wave with both hands instead of the single, controlled gesture she had been taught. When gently corrected later, she had asked, "Why can't I wave how I want to wave, Mummy? It makes people smile more." The question had haunted Catherine for days. Why couldn't her daughter wave how she wanted to wave? Why were natural expressions of joy and enthusiasm being trained out of her children before they were even teenagers? The realization that the protocols were shaping not just her own life, but her children's development was perhaps the most painful aspect of the changes. William was fighting his own battles with the new restrictions, though he tried to shield Catherine from the worst of the pressure he was facing from senior family members. During a particularly difficult week, he had confided that he felt like he was losing his wife to an institution that seemed determined to transform her into someone unrecognizable. "I fell in love with Kate Middleton," he had said one night as they lay in bed, the darkness making it easier for him to voice his fears. "I'm terrified that I'm watching her disappear, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but the Princess of Wales." Catherine had wanted to reassure him, but she shared the same fear. She could feel herself becoming more cautious, more calculated, less willing to take the emotional risks that had once seemed natural to her. The spontaneous laughter that had once bubbled up during public engagements was now carefully modulated. The tears that had once flowed freely when she encountered human suffering were now controlled and contained. Her relationship with the press had become increasingly strained as journalists began to comment on her changed demeanor. Articles appeared questioning whether Catherine was happy, whether she was struggling with the pressures of royal life, whether the sparkle had gone out of her public appearances. The irony was crushing. The protocols designed to protect her from negative coverage were generating exactly the kind of speculation they were meant to prevent. During a private moment with her lady-in-waiting, Sarah, Catherine had broken down completely. Sarah had been with her since the early days of her marriage, and she had witnessed the gradual transformation with growing concern. "I don't know who I'm becoming," Catherine had sobbed. "I look in the mirror and I see someone I don't recognize. I hear myself speaking words that feel like they're coming from someone else. I feel like I'm disappearing into this role, and I don't know how to stop it." Sarah had held her while she cried, and Catherine had felt, for a moment, like herself again. But the feeling had been fleeting quickly replaced by the familiar weight of expectation and restriction that now colored every aspect of her life. The impact on her health was becoming noticeable. Catherine had always been naturally slender, but the stress of the changes had affected her appetite and sleep patterns. William had begun to express concern about her weight loss, and her doctor had gently suggested that stress management might be beneficial. But how could she manage stress that came from the very nature of her existence? The restrictions weren't temporary challenges to be overcome. They were permanent features of her new reality. Every day brought reminders of freedoms lost, connections severed, and authentic moments replaced by carefully orchestrated performances. Her charitable work, once a source of deep fulfillment, had become a series of photo opportunities and ceremonial appearances. The organization she patroned still benefited from her involvement, but Catherine felt increasingly disconnected from the actual work being done. She was becoming a figurehead rather than a participant, a symbol rather than a person. The children's schools have been instructed to limit Catherine's involvement in typical parental activities. The days of helping with school fairs, attending sports days informally, or participating in parent-teacher conferences without extensive security arrangements were over. Catherine watched other mothers engage naturally with their children's education, while she became increasingly isolated from these normal experiences. Her friendships outside the royal family were suffering under the weight of the new protocols. Friends who had once felt comfortable calling spontaneously or arranging casual meetups found themselves navigating bureaucratic obstacles that made maintaining relationships difficult. Catherine could feel these connections weakening, leaving her more isolated within the royal bubble. The palace staff, while remaining professional and loyal, had also been affected by the changes. The warm, family-like atmosphere that Catherine had worked to create at Kensington Palace had given way to a more formal environment where spontaneous interactions were discouraged. Catherine missed the easy conversations with housekeeping staff, the jokes shared with security officers, the personal relationships that had made the palace feel like a home rather than an institution. Even her private time was being affected. Her beloved photography, once a creative outlet that allowed her to capture authentic moments, was now subject to review and approval. The images she took of her children, her gardens, her private moments of joy were scrutinized for potential misinterpretation or security concerns. Catherine found herself questioning whether the monarchy she was serving was the same institution she had married into. The values of connection, service, and authenticity that had attracted her to royal life seemed to be giving way to a more defensive, risk-averse approach that prioritized protection over purpose. As winter deepened around the palace, Catherine felt a corresponding chill settling into her own spirit. The woman who had once approached each day with enthusiasm and confidence now faced her responsibilities with a growing sense of dread. She was becoming someone she didn't recognize, serving an institution that seemed determined to transform her into its image rather than allowing her to bring her own gifts to the role. The realization that this might be permanent, that the Catherine the public had fallen in love with might never return, was beginning to feel overwhelming. Each day brought new evidence that she was expected to sacrifice more of herself in service to protocols that seemed designed to protect the monarchy from the very humanity that had made it relevant. The pale morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows as Catherine stood in her bedroom, holding a small wooden box that contained mementos from her pre-royal life. Inside were ticket stubs from concerts she and William had attended while dating, photographs from university, a pressed flower from their first official engagement together. These simple objects felt like artifacts from another person's life. 6 months had passed since the protocol changes had begun, and Catherine could see the full scope of her transformation reflected in the woman looking back at her from the mirror. The spontaneous smile that had once lit up her face during public engagements had been replaced by a more measured, controlled expression. The easy laughter that had endeared her to millions was now carefully modulated for appropriateness. The breaking point had come during a visit to a children's cancer ward the previous week. Catherine had been following her carefully scripted schedule when she encountered 8-year-old Michael, a patient who had been following her charitable work and had specifically requested to meet her. His mother had explained that meeting Catherine was one of Michael's greatest wishes as he underwent his treatment. Under the old protocols, Catherine would have spent as much time as Michael needed, listening to his stories, looking at his drawings, perhaps even sitting on his bed to be closer to his eye level. Under the new restrictions, she was allocated exactly 10 minutes for the interaction, with specific guidelines about maintaining appropriate physical distance and staying on approved conversational topics. As Catherine had sat rigidly in the designated chair, watching Michael's hopeful expression slowly fade as she delivered rehearsed responses to his eager questions, she had felt something fundamental break inside her. This child, facing the greatest challenge of his young life, deserved her authentic presence, her real emotions, her genuine care. Instead, he was receiving a performance from someone who looked like Catherine but felt like a stranger. That night, Catherine had made a decision that would change everything. She requested a private meeting with King Charles, something she had never done before in her years as a member of the royal family. The conversation that followed would reshape not just her own future, but the entire approach to royal protocol. "Your Majesty," Catherine had begun, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say, "I need to speak with you about the direction we're taking with these new protocols. I believe we're losing something essential." Charles had listened intently as Catherine laid out her concerns, not just about her own well-being, but about the impact the changes were having on the monarchy's connection with the people it served. She shared the letters she had received from individuals whose lives had been touched by her previous, more authentic approach. She showed him the polling data that revealed growing public concern about her changed demeanor. The monarchy's strength has always come from its ability to evolve while maintaining its core purpose, Catherine had said, drawing upon everything she had learned about royal history during her years in the family. But these changes aren't evolution, they're retreat. We're pulling back from the very connections that make us relevant. The conversation had continued for nearly 2 hours, with Charles asking probing questions about Catherine's vision for her role and the future of royal engagement. William had joined them for the final portion of the discussion, adding his own observations about the impact of the changes on their family and their ability to serve effectively. Charles had been surprisingly receptive to Catherine's concerns. As someone who had spent decades waiting to serve as king, he understood the frustration of being constrained by protocols that seemed to limit rather than enhance effective service. He had also witnessed firsthand the public's positive response to Catherine's more authentic approach during her early years as a royal. The protocols were implemented with the best intentions, Charles had acknowledged. But if they're preventing us from serving our people effectively, then they need to be reconsidered. The weeks that followed had been filled with intensive discussions involving palace advisors, security experts, and communication specialists. Catherine had been invited to participate in these conversations, something that would have been unthinkable under the previous approach where protocols were imposed rather than developed collaboratively. Gradually, a new framework began to emerge that balanced the legitimate need for security and consistency with the equally important need for authentic human connection. The rigid time limits for public interactions were relaxed, allowing Catherine to respond naturally to the situation she encountered. The pre-approved conversation topics were replaced with general guidelines that preserved her ability to engage spontaneously while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Most importantly, the new approach recognized that Catherine's authenticity was not a liability to be managed, but an asset that strengthened the monarchy's connection with the public. The protocols were rewritten to support rather than constrain her natural ability to empathize and connect. The first public engagement under the revised protocols had been a return visit to the children's cancer ward. Catherine had asked specifically to see Michael again, and this time she had been able to spend over an hour with him, looking at his art projects, hearing about his treatment, and simply being present with him in the way she had always done naturally. As she had hugged Michael goodbye, a gesture that would have been impossible under the previous restrictions, Catherine had felt like herself again for the first time in months. The child's radiant smile and his mother's tearful gratitude reminded her why she had chosen this life of service in the first place. The public response to Catherine's return to form had been immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Social media was filled with observations about how much more relaxed and natural she seemed. The press coverage focused on her renewed energy and connection with the people she met. Most importantly, the individuals and organizations she supported felt that they were once again receiving her authentic attention and care. Her relationship with William had begun to heal as the pressures that had strained their marriage were gradually reduced. The man who had feared he was losing his wife to an institution began to see glimpses of Kate Middleton returning alongside the Princess of Wales. Their private moments together became lighter, filled with the easy conversation and shared laughter that had always characterized their partnership. The children, too, began to relax as the atmosphere around family life became less rigid. George's natural curiosity about his future role was met with honest, age-appropriate discussions rather than formal instruction. Charlotte's exuberant personality was once again encouraged rather than constrained. Lewis continued to bring joy and spontaneity to their daily routines. Catherine's charitable work was transformed as she was able to once again engage deeply with the causes she supported. The mental health advocacy that had always been close to her heart became even more powerful as she was able to share her own vulnerabilities and struggles in a way that resonated with others facing similar challenges. Her social media presence evolved to reflect a balance between the personal insights that had made her so relatable and the dignity expected of her position. The posts that emerged were genuine but thoughtful, offering glimpses into her life and passions while respecting the privacy and security needs of her family. The staff at Kensington Palace noticed the change immediately. The warm, family-like atmosphere that had been stifled by excessive formality began to return. Catherine once again knew the names of housekeeping staff's children, asked about their personal challenges and celebrations, and created an environment where people felt valued as individuals rather than just employees. Her friendships outside the royal family began to flourish again as the barriers that had made casual interaction impossible were reduced. While security considerations still required some planning, the relationships that had sustained Catherine through her transition into royal life were able to resume their natural rhythm. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine found that she was able to sleep peacefully again. The anxiety and self-doubt that had characterized her recent months gave way to a renewed sense of purpose and confidence. She woke each morning looking forward to the day's engagements rather than dreading them. The experience had taught Catherine valuable lessons about the importance of advocating for herself and for the values she brought to her role. She had learned that tradition and innovation could coexist, that protecting the monarchy didn't require sacrificing its humanity, and that her authentic self was not something to be hidden, but something to be thoughtfully shared. As she looked back on the difficult months of transition, Catherine felt grateful for the struggle that had ultimately led to a more sustainable and fulfilling approach to her role. The protocols that had threatened to erase her individuality had instead forced her to articulate and fight for the values that made her service meaningful. Standing once again before her wardrobe, Catherine selected a blue dress, the same style she had chosen during those difficult early mornings months ago. But now, the simple act felt different. She was no longer choosing what to wear as someone playing a role. She was choosing what to wear as herself, someone who happened to serve as the Princess of Wales. The transformation was complete, but not in the way the original protocols had intended. Instead of becoming a more conventional, risk-averse version of royalty, Catherine had evolved into something more powerful. A royal who had maintained her authenticity while gaining the wisdom to navigate her unique position with both grace and purpose. As she prepared to face the day, Catherine felt a deep sense of peace about who she had become and excitement about the service she was able to offer. The woman looking back at her from the mirror was recognizably the same person who had married into the royal family years earlier. but with a deeper understanding of her own strength and the importance of remaining true to herself even within the most constrained circumstances. The protocols had shifted, but so had Catherine, not into someone unrecognizable, but into a more complete version of herself, someone who could serve with both dignity and humanity, someone who proved that the monarchy's future lay not in retreating from human connection, but in embracing it more thoughtfully and intentionally than ever before.